I'd been in plenty of rooms where people sized me up the second I walked in, but nothing compared to the moment I pushed open the door of courtroom 2 Amperes in Knox County. The temperature didn't change, but it felt like the whole place dropped 10 degrees. I'd barely taken 3 steps when every pair of eyes locked onto the uniform. Not the people wearing it, just the uniform. It happens a lot. You stop being a person for a second and become something they don't know how to read. My sister, Lydia, sat on the left side with this smug little grin, like she had already gotten what she came for. Same grin she wore the day she stole my favorite jacket in high school and told our mother I'd lost it. It hadn't improved with age. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her legs, and made sure I caught the expression. Message received. My mother was right beside her, dressed like she was attending a church luncheon, instead of dragging her younger daughter into court. She didn't smirk. She didn't smile. She just shook her head with that disappointed look she'd perfected when I was 10. If she'd wanted me to feel like an unwelcome guest, she didn't need the courtroom. She spent most of my life making sure I understood that note well enough. The judge had been flipping through papers when I walked in. He froze like someone had hit pause on him. His glasses dropped slightly down his nose, and his hands stayed suspended in the air, still holding a page he never finished turning. For a moment, he didn't even look at my face. His eyes were fixed on the ribbons on my chest, and the longer he stared, the more it felt like the air thickened around us. He whispered something. I didn't catch all of it, but I knew the tone. That soft, startled exhale usually happens right before someone says they recognize me from a mission brief they weren't supposed to have read, or from a citation buried in a military newsletter, or from that ceremony the Pentagon live-streamed that one time, the one I tried very hard to forget. The bailiff cleared his throat loudly enough to break whatever spell the judge was under. A few people in the gallery turned in their seats to get a better look. Small-town courts don't get many surprises, especially not in dress uniforms. The last person who probably walked in here in one was a retired Coast Guard captain paying a parking ticket. This wasn't a sight they expected on a Tuesday morning. I didn't blame them for staring. It had been a while since even I'd seen myself in this uniform. I wore it for funerals, formal boards, and now apparently for family lawsuits. Not exactly the list of occasions you dream about as a kid. The sound of my shoes against the floor echoed more than I liked. There's a rhythm drilled into you after enough years in the Navy. Heels down, shoulders square, chin level. People think uniforms are stiff. It's the posture you build wearing them that feels like armor. Today, I needed every inch of it. I stopped at the defense table. No lawyer sat next to me. Lydia had some local guy with too much gel in his hair who kept adjusting his tie like he'd been practicing in the mirror all morning. I didn't hire representation. The only thing I needed to bring was the truth, and it fit neatly inside a manila folder I carried under my arm. Paper can't lie the way people do. The judge finally snapped back to reality, cleared his throat, and tried to act like the last 20 seconds hadn't just happened. Case number 50, 2C, Corrigan versus Corrigan. He glanced at me again, his expression shifting into something I couldn't read. Respect, maybe. Shock, definitely. A hint of guilt in there, too. Judges aren't supposed to react like that. But he was human before he put on the robe, and humans slip. Lydia leaned closer to her attorney and said something under her breath. He nodded with the confidence of a man who had no idea what he was walking into. My mother kept staring straight ahead like she hoped ignoring me would make me vanish. We'd done that dance before. She spent half my childhood pretending she didn't notice when I won things, the other half pretending she didn't notice when I left. I set the folder on the table and placed my cover beside it. The metal brim tapped against the wood. It wasn't loud, but in a quiet courtroom it might as well have been a gunshot. A few jurors from the room next door glanced through the glass window in the hall. One of them mouthed something to the others. They were close enough to speculate, but not close enough to hear anything. That made things worse. People will believe anything if you give them silence to fill. The judge looked down at the file again. Miss Corrigan, Lieutenant Commander. The bailiff corrected under his breath, apparently louder than he intended. The judge blinked and nodded. Lieutenant Commander Corrigan. His second attempt carried a different tone, measured, careful. We are here to address the petition submitted by your sister, Lydia Corrigan. I didn't look at Lydia. I knew the expression she was wearing without seeing it. Victory before the battle starts. She'd always been good at confidence she hadn't earned. the judge continued. The claim alleges abandonment of inherited property, neglect of financial responsibilities, and— He stopped mid-sentence and looked up. His eyes landed on my uniform again as if he couldn't help himself. I stayed silent. Some moments don't need words, and some words aren't worth wasting breath on. A faint murmur rippled through the back row. Someone whispered, "Is she really?" before being shushed. In a town like this, rumors move faster than official records. My mother finally turned her head a fraction of a degree, just enough to glance at me like I'd wandered into church wearing combat boots. For a woman who raised 2 daughters, she always acted like she only ended up with one. Lydia got the praise, the attention, the space to fail without consequences. I got the guilt trips and the accusations that I was trying too hard, being too much, wanting too many things she didn't understand. The judge shifted in his seat. "Before we begin, Lieutenant Commander, do you have representation?" "No, Your Honor." A ripple of whispers again. No lawyer in a family dispute wasn't common, but I wasn't worried. I knew the facts better than anyone, and I had the receipts literally. My sister tilted her head, smirk widening. She thought that meant I was unprepared. She'd always confused quiet for weak. That was her first mistake, and judging by the calm way she adjusted her skirt like she'd already won, she hadn't learned a thing since the last time she'd tried to outmaneuver me. The judge glanced toward her table, then back at me. He hesitated for a moment, and something in his expression shifted again. Recognition. Not the kind you get from social media or local gossip, but the kind that comes from a headline someone never forgets. His voice softened. "Lieutenant Commander, is that really you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence did the work for me, and the room settled into a stillness so tight it felt like you could hear the dust floating. The judge cleared his throat and continued the hearing, but the tone of the room had changed. Not a single person shifted in their seat. Not a cough, not a shoe scrape, not even a breath that wasn't held a little too long. Whatever they expected this morning, it wasn't this. And as the judge prepared to read the first allegation, the only thing that mattered was the truth sitting inside the folder in front of me, waiting to be opened in a room that wasn't nearly ready for it. The judge's eyes dropped back to the paperwork, and I loosened my grip on the edge of the defense table just enough to feel the wood instead of the tension running through my hand. It was a small shift, barely noticeable, but it grounded me long enough to remember why I was here and how this whole mess had started 3 days earlier when I opened my mailbox, expecting bills, and found a cream-colored envelope stamped with the county seal. The letter had been wedged between a hardware store flyer and a coupon booklet, the kind of junk mail I usually grabbed in one fist and tossed straight into the recycling bin, but the seal caught my eye. I'd seen it before on a courthouse building I used to walk past as a kid while holding my grandfather's hand. He would point at the steps and tell me that the truth had a funny way of showing up in places that looked boring. I didn't realize at the time how ironic that would feel now. I tore the envelope open with my thumb and scanned the contents. Petition for property reassignment, allegation, abandonment. There wasn't a lot of legal fluff around it, just the meat of the accusation. My name at the top as the defendant, my sister's as the plaintiff, my mother listed as a supporting witness. For a second, I stood in the driveway staring at Lydia's name like it was a typo. Then the cold clarity hit. She wasn't bluffing. She'd gone all the way through with it. Inside the house, Cooper, my old mutt who limped worse than I did, lifted his head from the couch. He gave me that look, the one he uses whenever he senses I'm about to do something human and stupid. I dropped the envelope on the kitchen table, the same table I'd refinished last year, and sat down hard enough that the chair legs scraped. The first thought wasn't anger. It should have been, but it wasn't. It was disbelief. Out of all the ways Lydia could have tried to get what she wanted, she'd chosen this one, dragging me into court, claiming I'd abandoned the property, pretending she'd been the responsible one. It almost would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. I reread the accusation 3 times, each line sinking deeper. Failure to maintain property. No communication with family. Neglect of legal responsibilities. I didn't need a lawyer to tell me the claims were weak. Half of them were lies. The other half were things she'd twisted into something that sounded selfish. Lydia was always good at spinning a story, as long as she was the hero. The letter didn't mention the taxes I paid every year, or the automatic transfers I'd set up while I was overseas. It didn't mention the years I mailed checks from bases where the sand covered everything. even your thoughts. It definitely didn't mention the nights I stayed awake, wondering if the house was falling apart and whether the roof would hold through another Maine winter. But Lydia wasn't interested in truth. She wanted the land. She always wanted what belonged to other people. The smell of coffee from the pot I'd brewed earlier lingered in the air. I poured myself a cup even though it had gone lukewarm. The bitterness helped me stay focused. I pulled the chair closer to the table and opened the laptop I barely used outside of paperwork. I needed information, timelines, and whatever else would make sense of the situation. A quick search pulled up the case number Lydia had filed. My sister hadn't waited long after her last failed investment. I recognized the filing date. It was 2 weeks after her business license had been suspended. So, that was the real reason. She wasn't trying to protect anything. She was trying to fix her own mess with something that wasn't hers. I leaned back, letting the chair creak under my weight. The kitchen felt too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against the walls. Cooper walked over and nudged my leg with his nose. His limp made the sound of his steps uneven. He rested his head on my knee, and I scratched behind his ear because it kept my hands busy. The letter still sat on the table like it was staring at me. Abandonment. The word pulled up an entirely different memory, not legal, not civil, but personal. My mother's voice in the living room the night I left for boot camp. "You're abandoning the family, Haley," she'd said. "Running away doesn't make you strong." And Lydia had stood beside her with her arms crossed, nodding along like she was the righteous one. I remember that moment clearly, because it was the first time I felt completely alone while still standing in the same room as the people who raised me. I took another sip of the bitter coffee and stared at the uniform hanging in the hallway closet. I hadn't worn it in months, maybe longer. Dress blues always felt heavier than the camis, even with the same fabric weight. They carried too much history, too many meanings. But as I looked at the envelope again, at the accusations spelled out in neat legal formatting, something inside me made the decision before I consciously did. If Lydia wanted to paint me as the irresponsible one, then I would walk into that courtroom as the exact opposite. I stood, opened the closet, and ran my fingers over the fabric. The metals caught the light from the kitchen window. I didn't polish them for occasions like this. They weren't meant to be decorative props in some family showdown. They were pieces of a life my family barely understood. But right now, they were the most honest part of the story. The day I called the courthouse to confirm the hearing, the clerk paused when I gave my full name. "Lieutenant Commander Corrigan?" she asked. Her tone shifted instantly, respect mixed with surprise. It was the opposite reaction of my family. I didn't need anyone's praise, but acknowledgement was a strange feeling after so many years of silence. Preparing for the hearing felt like prepping for a mission brief. Organized, methodical, controlled. I pulled out a stack of receipts, bank statements, tax records. Every year was accounted for. The automatic transfers from bases across the world, the manual payments when the system glitched, the fees I covered when the county raised property rates. I had a paper trail longer than my sister's list of excuses, and unlike her, my story didn't change under pressure. The folder filled quickly. I tucked everything inside and slid it shut. There was a quiet satisfaction in the weight of it, not because I wanted revenge, but because truth shouldn't feel like a gamble. On the morning of the hearing, I woke before the alarm. That's something deployment does to you. You learn to sleep lightly and get up fast. I showered, shaved, tied my hair tight enough to keep any loose strands from brushing my collar. The uniform felt stiff at first, but once I adjusted the sleeves, it settled against me like muscle memory. Cooper watched from the doorway, tail thumping slowly like he knew something was different. I knelt and rubbed his head. "Guard the place," I whispered, and he pressed his forehead against mine like he understood. When I grabbed my keys, the folder, and my cover, I didn't hesitate. There wasn't room for it. Not after reading the accusations. Not after remembering the way Lydia smiled when she tore me down the first time. The drive was quiet, and the closer I got to the courthouse, the more the landscape of my childhood drifted past the windowed streets I used to bike down, stores that hadn't changed in 20 years, the diner where my mother once bragged about Lydia's spelling bee trophy while pretending not to hear when I mentioned I'd gotten a scholarship. I pulled into the parking lot early, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. The courthouse doors reflected the morning light, and through the glass I could already see silhouettes moving inside. I stepped out, straightened my uniform, and walked toward the building with the folder tucked under my arm. And as the bailiff held the door open and I felt the air-conditioned chill of the courthouse wash over me, I knew exactly why I was here and what had to happen next, whether anyone in that room was ready for it or not. The judge's voice settled into a steady rhythm as he read the opening statements, but it barely touched the noise building in the back of my mind. Sitting there, with Lydia's perfume drifting across the aisle and my mother shifting in her seat like she wanted to pretend she wasn't part of any of this, pulled me straight into memories I'd gone out of my way to keep buried. They didn't wait for permission, they just showed up. My foot tapped once under the table, not from nerves, but from the same instinct that used to hit me right before a briefing. You brace without realizing it. The courtroom lights hummed faintly overhead. I lifted my chin a little higher, knowing exactly what scene was replaying itself, whether I wanted it to or not. It started with the kitchen, the old one in the house where we grew up. The yellowing cabinets, the dent in the refrigerator door from when Lydia slammed it shut too hard during one of her dramatic teenage meltdowns, the cheap ceramic rooster my mother insisted was homey. I could smell the lemon cleaner she used every Saturday morning. That place was burned into my senses so deeply I could walk through it blindfolded. The night I told my family I was enlisting, my mother stood right in front of that ceramic rooster with her arms crossed, like she needed backup. Lydia stood next to her wearing a smirk that hadn't aged a day, judging by the one she wore in court this morning. Dad was sitting at the table with his elbows on his knees, staring down at the floor like he'd misplaced a thought and was trying to find it. My mother's voice had a way of turning sharp without getting loud. "You're joining the Navy?" she said, like the word itself was a slur. I remember answering in the same calm tone I used when explaining procedures to 20-year-old sailors who didn't want to be there. "Yes, Mom. I passed everything. I'm leaving in 2 weeks." "You can't just decide that," she shot back. That was a funny thing to hear, considering she let Lydia decide everything else. Her college major, her gap year, the guy she dated who wore too much cologne and had no job. My choices were always dramatic, or selfish, even when they only affected me. Lydia chimed in, twirling a strand of hair. "You? The Navy? Since when?" "Since I applied," I said. She snorted. "You think putting on combat boots will make you special? You just want attention." The worst part wasn't the words. It was how casual she sounded, like she genuinely believed she was stating a universal truth. Dad finally looked up that night, sighing the way he always did when conflict got too close. "Haley, maybe you should think this through. It's dangerous." "Then, it's also the first thing I've ever actually wanted," I said. That was the moment the air in the room shifted. My mother stiffened. Lydia squinted like I'd insulted her personally. Dad pinched the bridge of his nose. And then my mother said the sentence that permanently hit a switch inside me. "You just want to prove you're better than your sister." I'd stood there stunned, because out of all the reasons I joined, that one wasn't even on the list, not even at the bottom. I didn't enlist for them or against them. I did it because it felt like the first choice I'd ever made for myself. But talking to my mother was like talking to a mirror that only reflected the worst possible version of you. That night was the first time I realized the family I was born into and the family I wanted weren't the same thing. I didn't slam the door when I left the house later. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I packed quietly, set my alarm, and left before the sun rose. It was cleaner that way. Less dramatic than the arguments my parents had weekly but never acknowledged. What stuck with me wasn't even the accusation. It was how easily they dismissed my plans, like they'd been waiting for me to mess something up so they could say they were right. Lydia never had that problem. If she tripped over her own ego, they called it confidence. If I did something with purpose, they called it stubborn. Same actions, different narrators. The courtroom chair under me wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't any worse than the benches we used to sit on during training. My posture didn't move an inch. My mother sat on the other side of the aisle, clutching her purse like someone might steal it, despite the fact that the only thieves in the room were figurative and related to her. Lydia caught my eye for a second and smiled one of those smiles people use when they think they've outsmarted you. It used to get under my skin when we were younger. Today it barely registered. Whatever confidence she had came from a lifetime of being told she couldn't fail. That kind of person always breaks first when the facts turn against them. The judge continued reading from a stack of documents. Lydia nodded at all the right moments, pretending she understood legal language beyond the parts she highlighted in her copy. My mother kept adjusting the collar of her blouse, probably judging the courtroom's taste and decor because it was easier than acknowledging the real situation. The air in the courtroom stayed tense, but my breathing stayed even. That was another thing the Navy gave me. No matter what room I was in, my body defaulted to discipline before panic. Lydia once told a friend I was emotionally cold. Maybe it looked that way from her vantage point on a pedestal she built for herself. Growing up, she got the bedroom with the bigger window and the nicer dresser. She got the new clothes while I got the still perfectly good hand-me-downs. She got the praise at dinner, I got the questions about why I couldn't be more like her. My achievements were always footnotes. Hers were headlines. The only person who ever balanced the scale was my grandfather. He didn't sugarcoat anything, but he didn't tear me down either. He taught me how to repair fences, drive a manual truck, and sand wood until the grain looked clean enough to run water over. He told me once, while we stood outside watching the sun drop behind the barn, "Kid, you've got grit. Don't waste time proving it to people who don't want to see it." He was the reason I never quit. Not during training, not during deployment, not after the blast that almost left me with more metal than bone in my leg. If he had been alive, I knew exactly where he would have been today. Right here, in the front row, arms crossed, ready to glare anyone into dust if they spoke against me. Lydia wouldn't have dared file a lawsuit while he was breathing. She waited until the only adult who saw me clearly was gone. The judge flipped another page, the sound crisp in the still air. Lydia's lawyer straightened his notes. My mother inhaled sharply, as if bracing for something that hadn't happened yet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. My uniform collar sat snug against my neck. Everything around me was exactly where it needed to be. Everything inside me was steady. And as the judge adjusted his glasses and prepared to open the floor for the first formal argument, I kept my eyes forward, knowing the next moments would hit harder than anyone in that room was prepared for, including my sister. The judge shifted a stack of papers to the side, and the scrape of the folder against the desk pulled a familiar tension up my spine, the same kind I used to feel right before stepping into the briefing room overseas. My breathing settled into that same even pace I'd learned years ago, the one that steadied me whether I was dealing with a busted engine, a sandstorm, or a lieutenant who thought shouting was the same thing as leadership. Sitting in a courtroom instead of a command center didn't change the instinct. My body remembered the rhythm even if nobody else in the room did. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, and for a moment the sound blurred into the whine of generators from an old forward operating base in eastern Iraq. I didn't fight the memory. It arrived clean, not dramatic, just the way my mind stored the years that built me. We'd landed at dusk, the air thick with heat, the kind that stuck to your skin even after the sun dropped. I was barely 2 years into active duty then, still figuring out how to blend confidence with common sense. My job wasn't glamorous. People hear Navy and assume you're either a diver or a spy. The truth is, most of us keep things running so the flashier people can do their part without the whole operation falling apart. I handled logistics, comms, emergency routing. Not the kind of thing that made headlines, but the kind of thing that kept people alive. Lydia always said I hid behind spreadsheets. If she had seen even one day inside the TOC, she would have fainted from the amount of responsibility. On that deployment, the base felt like a different planet. The dust got into everything, your eyes, your teeth, your thoughts. Every time I opened a crate, a new layer of sand seemed to fall out. I used to joke that Afghanistan had better dust, just to watch people get confused about whether I was serious. You make strange jokes when you're exhausted and running on instant coffee that tastes like burnt plastic. That night, Lewis Chief Petty Officer Lewis Carter leaned over an overloaded radio console and muttered, "If this thing dies one more time, I'm mailing myself home in it." I laughed because he said everything like it was the last line of a sitcom. Carter was the closest thing I had to a friend out there. Not a dramatic movie friendship, just the steady kind where you can sit in silence fixing gear and not want to leave. He used to tease me for double-checking every connection. I used to tease him for eating those awful jalapeno MREs like they were gourmet. His laugh stuck with me long after the explosion that took it from the world. The IED hit during a supply convoy we'd been coordinating. I wasn't in the truck, but I heard the blast from the base. Training takes over fast. You don't think, you move. Reports came in, scrambled and panicked. I remember dialing frequency after frequency, trying to get a clear read on who was down. When Carter's name came through as unresponsive, something sank in me that didn't lift for weeks. The military has a way of teaching you to keep going even when you can't stand still. You can be grieving, limping, exhausted, burned out, but if the next task hits the board, you tackle it. That's how I pushed through rehab after the shrapnel tore up my leg. The doctors called it a clean recovery. Anyone who's ever learned to walk again knows there's no such thing as a clean recovery. The limp came later. The quiet anger came even later. The clarity showed up last. By the time I was discharged, my hair was shorter, my record was longer, and my tolerance for nonsense had evaporated. I walked out with a knee brace, a pension, and enough experience to fill a manual. When I came home, nobody was waiting at the airport. Not that I expected them to be. My mother didn't like airports. My sister didn't like anything that didn't revolve around her. My father didn't like confronting emotions unless they were anger or disappointment. I took a taxi to a rental house near the harbor, unlocked the door, and stood in the middle of the empty living room, listening to the click of the clock in the kitchen. That was my welcome home: one clock, an empty room, and a knee that throbbed every time the weather changed. But there was no panic in it, no collapse. It was calm in the way a blank page is calm. You don't know what comes next, but at least there's room to write it. I bought my own house a year later. Nothing fancy. A single-story place with peeling paint and a yard full of weeds tall enough to hide a small family. I fixed it up the same way I fixed equipment, one small task at a time, until the whole thing behaved. Cooper showed up in the middle of all that. Someone abandoned him on the road near the base. He limped from an old injury, same as me. I took him in without thinking about it. The vet told me he might not run again. I said that made two of us. Life went quiet for a while after that. Not empty, just quiet. I built routines, kept my space in order, replaced memories I didn't want with small comforts like good coffee and long walks. For the first time, nobody told me what I should be doing or who I should be more like. I got used to the silence in a way that made family noise feel foreign. Then the courthouse envelope showed up, and suddenly, the version of life I'd built, simple, intentional, clean, got interrupted by the same people who once told me I'd regret leaving. Sitting in that courtroom now, listening to Lydia whisper to her lawyer while my mother clutched her purse like she was holding on to her last shred of dignity, I didn't feel fragile or overwhelmed. I felt prepared. Everything military life had drilled into me, the discipline, the steadiness, the ability to function under pressure, sat with me like a second spine. The judge cleared his throat, and Lydia's lawyer stood to begin his argument. I watched him straighten his tie, shuffle his notes, and shoot Lydia a reassuring smile. She tilted her chin like the queen of whatever petty kingdom she thought she ruled. My mother gave me a brief glance, one that flickered with something between guilt and denial, but she quickly looked away. The lawyer launched into a speech about abandonment, neglect, long-term absence. He talked like the property had been sitting on the edge of a cliff ready to collapse because I had been too busy pursuing personal interests. That phrase stood out, personal interests. If the Navy counted as a personal hobby, every recruiter in the country would be out of a job. As he kept talking, my mind kept its balance. Military life teaches you how to listen and wait. You don't jump at noise, you analyze the pattern behind it. His argument wasn't solid. It wasn't even consistent. He leaned heavily on emotion because the facts weren't on their side. My mother shifted again. Lydia kept glancing at me like she expected me to break. She always did like dramatic reactions. I didn't give her one. The judge scribbled a few notes, adjusting his glasses the way he did when something didn't quite align. The air in the courtroom tightened just a bit enough for most people to feel uncomfortable, but familiar enough to me that my pulse didn't change. Years in uniform didn't make me untouchable. They made me deliberate. And as the lawyer continued, stacking exaggeration on top of invention, I kept my posture straight, my breathing even, and my focus sharp, not because I was fighting them, but because everything that shaped me long before this day was sitting quietly in the room with me, steadying every part of who I had become. The lawyer droned on about ownership concerns and familial responsibility, but the minute his tone slipped into that dramatic upspeak attorneys use when they're padding weak arguments, my attention drifted not out of boredom, but because the weight of the folder under my palm reminded me exactly what this fight was really about. Not military service. Not their accusations. Not even the lawsuit itself. It was the land. My grandfather's land. The one place that ever felt like a piece of home instead of a test I could never pass. The judge lifted a brow at something the lawyer said, and while the man scrambled to rephrase, my mind moved easily to the first day I saw the property on my own after coming back from deployment. The road leading up to it was just as narrow as I remembered, the kind where you could swear the pine trees leaned in on purpose. The mailbox was still crooked, though the rust had spread so far across the metal it looked like a rash. I'd stood there with the keys in one hand and an iced knee in the other, taking in the chipped paint and sagging porch, and for once I didn't feel disappointed. I felt responsible. Grandpa bought that farm before he had kids, before he met my grandmother, before life settled into the rigid patterns my parents clung to like religion. He built half of it himself, hammered, sawed, and lifted his way through it with more stubbornness than blueprint knowledge. He used to joke that every crooked beam had a story behind it, which meant the whole house was basically a novel. When I was younger, he'd take me around with a toolbox that weighed almost as much as I did. We'd spend hours tightening screws, fixing hinges, sanding floors. He taught me how to look for rot in the boards, the same way he said I should look for rot in people quiet, careful, and never ignoring the first sign. My mother said he spoiled me. Lydia said he favored me. Grandpa said neither of them knew how to fix a damn thing, so he was investing where it counted. He was the only person who didn't roll his eyes when I brought home a recruitment brochure. Instead, he sat me at that wooden kitchen table, the one with the burn mark where he once dropped a soldering iron and listened. Not nodded, not judged, listened. He told me, "Haley, you get one life. Use it for something that matters, or someone else will use it for something that doesn't." That sentence was the closest thing I ever had to permission. When he passed, I was halfway around the world coordinating airlifts with a temp radio unit that barely worked. My mother's email said, "Funeral is Friday," with no details. Lydia said nothing. By the time I got back to the States, the marker on his grave had already settled into the grass. They didn't wait. They didn't ask. They didn't think they needed to. But the will, a simple handwritten document with his looping signature, named me. Not my mother, not Lydia, me. And suddenly, everyone who thought the farm was a burden started acting like it was an heirloom dipped in gold. When the clerk mailed me the deed transfer, I sat in my apartment with the envelope in my lap for a full hour before opening it. It felt like he'd reached out through time to hand me the thing he trusted me with most. I remember folding it back into the envelope and placing it inside the small lockbox I kept under my bed. I wasn't sentimental, but that piece of paper felt like the only thing that belonged to me without debate. So when I drove back there after getting the lawsuit notice, the sight of the porch sinking in the center felt like an accusation, just not against me, against them. Weeds crawled across the yard like they were trying to claim the place. The fence was leaning at an angle that made me wonder if the wind had a grudge. I walked up the porch steps, testing each one with my weight. The boards creaked, but not in a way that said they'd give up. More like they were complaining, which was fair. I ran my fingers over the doorframe, the same way Grandpa used to when he walked inside after working in the barn all day. That wood was familiar in a way nothing else in my life had been. Even the dust smelled like memory's sawdust, old oil, and whatever brand of pipe tobacco he used to hide from my grandmother. Inside, the house felt smaller than I remembered. The kitchen tiles were cracked. The ceiling had water stains. But the moment I stepped in, something steadier than nostalgia settled in my chest. This wasn't just a building. It was the one place where nobody demanded explanations. Nobody compared me. Nobody tried to shrink me down to match their comfort zone. I walked from room to room, flipping light switches out of habit even though I knew the power was shut off. My boots left faint prints on the wooden floor. The air was cool, and the kind of quiet you only get in old houses, thick, slow, almost patient. In the living room, I found the mark on the wall where Grandpa carved a notch after every birthday, tracking my height like I was a tree he'd planted. Lydia's marks were there too, but she stopped coming out after she turned 13. She said it was too rustic. She preferred the mall. The faint initials under the window, HC and HC, were still there. He carved them when I was 8. Harlan Corrigan and Haley Corrigan woodworking team, he said. I traced the grooves lightly, dust collecting on my fingertips. My mother once told everyone that the farm was too much responsibility for me, but the irony was right there in the floorboards. I had already been maintaining it long before any court filing. Standing in that house, I felt something shift. Not anger this time, but clarity. This land wasn't a prize in a family feud. It was the proof of a relationship that didn't need performance. That's what Lydia wanted to rewrite. She couldn't stand the idea that someone saw me as capable. She always needed me smaller so she could feel bigger. Back in the courtroom, her lawyer emphasized long-term personal absence like it was the smoking gun of the century. He didn't mention why I was absent. He didn't mention the uniform on my back or the knee that still stiffened when the temperature dropped. He didn't mention that every year since Grandpa passed, I had paid the property taxes on time, even when I was sending the payment from a base so dusty you couldn't tell what country you were in, unless someone told you. The judge glanced at him over the top of his glasses, the way men do when they've heard one too many embellished stories in their lifetime. Lydia straightened in her chair as if good posture could make the argument land better. My mother looked past me, not at me. That had always been her specialty. I rested my hand on the folder again, not because I needed reassurance, but because the smooth edge under my palm reminded me exactly who I was fighting for. Not myself. Not revenge. Not pride. For the man who carved my initials into the window frame and told me that doing the right thing wasn't supposed to feel easy. The judge shifted in his seat again, and the next motion of the hearing moved forward smoothly, the room filled with quiet tension that didn't rattle me in the slightest. The judge's pen made one last scratch across the page, and when he looked up, the air in the room shifted just enough for anyone paying attention to feel it. Lydia leaned forward slightly like she was waiting for applause, and her lawyer straightened his tie as if he'd already convinced the entire legal system with nothing more than a few dramatic adjectives. My mother kept her eyes locked on a point somewhere near the judge's shoes, probably hoping she could vanish by sheer concentration. The judge cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Commander Corrigan," he said, addressing me directly now. "Do you have anything to present before I move on?" I slid the folder forward, not with flair, not with any kind of dramatic courtroom swagger, just a steady push across the polished table. The weight of the papers inside spoke louder than any speech I could have prepared. I flipped it open with the same motion I used to open mission brief binders. Firm, precise, unshaken. These are statements, tax receipts, renovation invoices, and a full payment record of all property-related expenses for the past 13 years, I said, keeping my tone as even as if I were reading coordinates. Paid by me, not jointly, not partially, entirely. Lydia's lawyer blinked like someone had switched his teleprompter off. I turned a page. Here are the county assessor confirmations verifying receipt of payments from my account. Here is documentation of the automatic transfers while I was deployed overseas, and here, I tapped a clipped form, are the insurance renewals with my signature, every year, without exception. The judge took the stack. He didn't rush. He skimmed with the kind of steady forehead crease that suggested someone's story was about to fall apart. Lydia's fingers tightened around the handle of her purse. Her lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but she pulled back, irritated, as if his lack of a miracle was personally offensive. The judge paused halfway through the papers, raised his eyebrows, and looked up at my sister. "Miss Corrigan," he said carefully, "were you aware that your sister has been covering every cost associated with the property since your grandfather's passing?" Lydia's mouth opened a fraction. It's not exactly she." My mother shifted next to her. Not to defend me. She never did that growing up. It was more the shift of someone realizing the ground she chose to stand on wasn't as steady as she assumed. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. The judge set down the papers and interlaced his fingers. "This documentation is thorough, detailed, and," he glanced at each page again, "verifiable." He turned to Lydia's lawyer. "Did your client provide any evidence contradicting these payments?" The lawyer swallowed hard. "Your Honor, the issue at hand isn't strictly financial. Actually," the judge interrupted, "it is very much financial and factual." Lydia exhaled sharply, crossing her arms like she wanted to fold into herself but didn't want anyone to see her fold. She shot me a look sharp, narrow, and full of old resentment. The same one she used when she didn't get the car on a Friday night or when I got a scholarship she assumed belonged to her by default. I kept my eyes forward. I wasn't in this room to score emotional points. The judge turned back to me. "Lieutenant Commander, for clarification," during the years referenced, Were you deployed overseas? Yes, Your Honor. He narrowed his eyes softly. Where? Afghanistan, Iraq, Djibouti, South China Sea, and classified rotation with 7th Fleet, I said plainly. A murmur flickered through the benches behind us. Lydia tensed like she didn't appreciate being upstaged by facts. The judge rested his palms on the bench and leaned forward. So while you were deployed risking your life, serving this country, these payments continued? Yes, Your Honor. He stared at me for a moment, and something gentler crossed his expression. Recognition, maybe, or respect. It wasn't the kind that inflates a person. It was quieter than that. He flipped another page, stopped at a date, and looked up again. Lieutenant Commander, are you the same Haley Corrigan who participated in the 2019 rapid evacuation of U.S. personnel from Kunar Province? I didn't move, just nodded. Yes, Your Honor. He sat back, visibly processing. I remember reading that commendation. Lydia's forehead creased. Commendation for what? The judge answered her, not unkind but firmly. Her actions saved 47 American lives. I may. Silence spread slowly, thick enough that you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. My mother's hands stopped fidgeting. Lydia blinked twice, as if trying to register that someone she had spent her whole life minimizing was being described like that in front of a room full of strangers. I stayed still. Steadiness isn't performance, it's discipline. The judge exhaled, returning to a measured tone. Let's be clear. This court does not consider military service as a trump card in property disputes, but it does consider truth, responsibility, and intent. He tapped the stack of evidence. Everything presented here contradicts your claim completely. Lydia's lawyer opened his mouth again, but the judge raised one hand, stopping him. Unless you have verifiable documentation disproving these records, there is no legal standing for your petition. Endo. Lydia shifted in her chair, her jaw tightening. But she left. She was gone for years. I turned toward her for the first time that morning. I was deployed, I said, steady as a level on a carpenter's bench. You abandoned us. She shot back, bitterness sharp. You left me to deal with everything. The judge cut in before I had to. Your sister was serving her country. That is not abandonment under any legal definition I am aware of. My mother finally spoke, quietly, but with a tremble. We didn't know she paid all that. Her voice didn't carry blame, just confusion. For her, confusion always showed up where accountability should have been. The judge adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Corrigan, were you aware of your daughter's deployments? Yes, she whispered. And you still filed a claim alleging abandonment? My mother closed her eyes, then opened them slowly. We thought she didn't want anything to do with the family. Lydia jumped in. Exactly. She cut everyone off. She didn't even come home when Dad... I said nothing, though every word was familiar. Old accusations don't grow new roots. The judge held up a hand again. This is a property hearing, not group therapy. His tone wasn't harsh, just firm enough to push the conversation back onto legal rails. He flipped to the final page, scanned it, and gave a single nod. Everything here suggests long-term responsibility and clear ownership. Ender 4. The air tightened just a little more, not tense, just heavy enough to signal that a decision was already forming in his mind. He closed the folder, set it aside, and folded his hands again. Given the evidence, he said, this case is moving in a very different direction than the one presented by the plaintiffs. No one said a word, not Lydia, not her lawyer, not my mother. And I didn't move at all, sitting exactly as I had from the start, letting the room shift around me while my pulse stayed even, the grounding weight of truth settling calmly into the space between all of us. The judge placed my folder neatly to the side, and while the room absorbed his last sentence, I kept my posture anchored. Years of discipline made stillness easy, especially when the air got heavy like this. Lydia shifted in her seat, the way she always did whenever she sensed something slipping out of her control. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering quickly, but she stiffened instead of listening. My mother pressed her lips together in the tight, worried line she used whenever consequences got too close to home. The judge rested both hands on the bench. Before I proceed, he said, Lieutenant Commander, was there anything else you intended to provide to the court today? Any documents not already included? The question was routine, but something about the tone made Lydia straighten like she expected me to pull out a smoke bomb. I reached into my bag, not hurried, not dramatic, and placed a thin, older folder on the table. Brown, worn edges, slight wrinkle along the top. The lawyer blinked at it like he'd just spotted a ticking device. "This," I said calmly, "is the original will." The courtroom went still. Not the sanitized, photocopied version Lydia submitted. Not the summary my mother waved around in her affidavit. The real one. I slid the folder forward, using just enough pressure to make it clear I wasn't presenting a theory, I was presenting fact. The judge adjusted his glasses and opened it carefully, like he knew this wasn't the kind of thing you skim. His eyebrows lifted halfway down the first page. Lydia whispered sharply, "That's impossible." Her lawyer blinked hard. "Miss Corrigan, you said—" "I didn't know about that one," she hissed. The judge ignored the frantic whispers, reading silently. My mother leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as if the handwriting might change itself if she stared at it long enough. The paper inside wasn't typed. It was handwritten, the way my grandfather preferred to do anything meaningful. His cursive looked the same as it did on the notes he left me as a kid. Thin, looping, steady. The original signature sat at the bottom, bold enough to leave no room for argument. The judge cleared his throat. "This is significantly different from the version submitted by the plaintiffs." Lydia's lawyer swallowed. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," the judge replied without looking up. "I'm reading." He continued scanning, his brow deepening as he reached the second page. When he finally set the document down, he tapped it once with 2 fingers. "This will is notarized, signed, dated, and," he flipped to the back, "filed with a local attorney who appears to have been handling the decedent's affairs." I nodded. "Yes, sir. That attorney retired last year. He mailed the file to me after hearing about the lawsuit. He thought the court should have the original document instead of the edited summary my family sent." And Lydia's face flushed fast enough to be visible from my table. "Edited? It wasn't, we didn't, Mom, you said." My mother stiffened, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Your grandfather's will was confusing," she said quietly. "We thought we were simplifying." "By removing half of it?" I asked, my voice level. "Or by removing the part that left the property solely to me?" Lydia's neck snapped toward me. "He didn't mean just you." The judge held up a hand again, effectively shutting her down. "Miss Corrigan, unless you personally wrote this will or witnessed its signing, I suggest you refrain from assumptions." She sank back into her chair, fuming. The judge turned another page. "Lieutenant Commander, according to this, your grandfather left the property to you with specific instructions." He read aloud, slowly enough for every word to land. "To my granddaughter Haley Corrigan, who works harder than anyone gives her credit for. I leave the farm. She will care for it the way I cared for her. This land belongs to the one who shows respect, not the one who demands it." The room reacted in a soft ripple whispers. Shifting weight. The quiet shock that comes when truth isn't just spoken but proven in someone else's handwriting. Lydia sank deeper into her chair, staring ahead with the blank expression of someone who'd spent her whole life expecting applause and was now facing silence instead. The judge continued reading. "Any attempt by other parties to claim this land without her consent should be considered dishonest and contrary to my wishes." He closed the folder gently and exhaled. "That is unusually direct." A man in the back row muttered, "Sounds like he knew his family." The room chuckled under their breath before remembering they were in a courtroom. My mother's hand found her necklace, twisting it in tight circles, her tell when she was cornered. "He was old," she said quietly. "He didn't think clearly near the end." I turned to her, not angry, just blunt. "Mom, he thought clearly enough to leave that farm to someone who actually maintained it." Her shoulders tensed. Lydia jumped in, her voice sharp. "He always babied you. That doesn't make it legal." The judge tapped the open will. "Actually, this document does make it legal." I won. Lydia's jaw dropped, and for a moment she looked completely stunned, like she expected rules to bend just because she didn't like them. My mother swallowed. "We thought the other version was the most accurate record." The judge leaned back slightly, hands folding. "Mrs. Corrigan, the version you submitted removed entire sections of this will. That's not simplification. That is alteration." A flush crept up her neck. "It was never meant to be fraudulent," he supplied. My mother froze. Lydia's lawyer cleared his throat aggressively. trying to salvage anything he could. Your Honor, surely this matter requires verification, additional review, authentication. It does not, the judge said flatly. The document is notarized by a state, licensed official, witnessed by 2 parties, and filed with counsel. Unless your client has evidence of forgery, which I doubt she does, this stands. Lydia clenched her fists. She's lying. The judge turned his full gaze on her. Young lady, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. Lydia pressed her lips together so tightly they went pale. Her composure finally cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just in the subtle way she blinked too fast, jaw shaking for a moment before she forced it still. The judge returned his attention to the bench, closing the folder and placing his hands on either side of it. This will is legally binding, he said evenly. The property belongs to Lieutenant Commander Corrigan. Any further attempt to claim otherwise will be dismissed as baseless and potentially malicious. The word malicious hung longer than it needed to. No one spoke. No one shifted. No one breathed louder than necessary. The judge didn't rush. He let the truth settle, and in that settling the room recalibrated itself. This wasn't a fight anymore. The fight was over the moment that ink on paper met his eyes. I kept my posture steady and my breathing calm, the weight of my grandfather's words grounding me more firmly than any uniform ever had. The judge lifted his gavel not urgently, not ceremonially, just part of the natural rhythm of the proceeding, while the courtroom absorbed the reality that had finally come into focus, clear and undeniable. The judge lowered the gavel onto the block with a solid, unhurried tap, the kind that didn't need volume to declare a conclusion. The sound settled into the room like dust after construction, quiet, final, and leaving no space for anyone to pretend they didn't hear it. Lydia stared straight ahead, frozen in the kind of silence she usually reserved for moments when her confidence ran out. My mother's shoulders curled inward, as if shrinking might magically erase her involvement. Their lawyer shuffled his notes in a panic, searching for an argument that didn't exist. I didn't move. Stillness comes naturally when you've learned how to wait out both chaos and excuses. The judge closed the folder containing the original will and set it aside. The property belongs unequivocally to Lieutenant Commander Corrigan. This court sees no merit in the claims presented by the plaintiffs. There was no drama in his voice, no disappointment, no triumph, just decisive clarity. He added, "This hearing is adjourned," and stepped away from the bench with a calm stride that suggested he'd already shifted to whatever case waited next. The bailiff opened the door, people stood, papers rustled. Lydia stayed, seated a beat longer than everyone else, as if her legs needed time to accept reality. My mother rose slowly, still twisting her necklace chain, like she was trying to unsnarl every choice that led her here. I stood, gathering the documents with practiced precision. My hand brushed the edges of the will, and a steadying warmth settled in my chest, not pride, not victory, just confirmation. The kind that used to hit me after finishing a successful extraction or rerouting a convoy before it hit trouble. You don't celebrate. You verify the job is done, and move forward. I walked into the hallway, where the air felt cooler and carried the faint echo of footsteps. A few people nodded at me, small gestures, respectful but not intrusive. I didn't need applause. I just needed out of that building. But before I reached the exit, a familiar sound cut through the corridor, the sharp inhale my father made whenever he was about to say something he'd rehearsed in his head too many times. He stepped out from where he'd been waiting near a bench. He wasn't part of the hearing. He didn't testify. He didn't even sit inside the courtroom. He just hovered nearby like a man checking the distance between cowardice and regret. He looked older than I remembered. Not fragile, my father was never fragile, but worn in a way that didn't come from age alone. His work jacket hung loosely off his shoulders, grease stains on the sleeves, the same ones he'd collected like merit badges over a lifetime. The stubble on his jaw made him look like he'd left the house too fast. Or didn't sleep well. Hard to tell. He cleared his throat once. "You done in there?" His voice wasn't sharp like it used to be. Just rough, like gravel after rain. "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly, eyes flicking to the folder in my hand. "Judge went your way?" "That's how evidence works," I replied. He absorbed that answer without flinching. "And that will, the real one, that was his handwriting." "Yes." A long exhale left him, the kind that sounded more like surrender than breath. "I figured it would be." My father wasn't a man who apologized easily. When he felt wronged, he yelled. When he felt guilty, he went quiet. He was quiet now. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Your sister's been worked up about that farm for months, kept saying she deserved it, kept talking about plans, talking big. Your mother kept backing her up, like always. His voice dropped. But I knew he wouldn't have left it to them. A part of me braced, instinctively, waiting for the pivot blame, defensiveness, excuses. But none came. My father rubbed the back of his neck. Your granddad. He always said you were the one paying attention. Said you were the only one he trusted with anything that had screws and moving parts. A reluctant smirk touched his lips. Said the others would just repaint problems instead of fixing them. That was the closest thing to a compliment I'd heard from him in over a decade. He looked at me, not past me, not through me, at me. I should have come inside, should have backed you up. But your mother, well, she thinks she has to win everything. Doesn't matter if it's a casserole contest or a court case. I didn't soften. I didn't harden either. I just listened. My father let out a breath that seemed to deflate the tightness in his chest. I knew she was wrong, Lydia too, but I didn't say anything because, hell, I don't know, didn't want another fight at home, didn't want to make it worse. It wasn't an apology yet, but it wasn't denial. That alone was more than I expected. He ran a hand down his face. You were right to fight them. And he, your granddad, he'd be glad you did. He left it for a reason, I said. Yeah, my father replied quietly. He did. His gaze drifted to my uniform, lingering on the ribbons. Not out of awe, he'd never been the awe type, but with a kind of belated understanding. I never said it, he began, voice steady but low. But you did good, with your life, the service, everything. I didn't get it then. His jaw tightened. I get it now. The words didn't hit like fireworks. They settled like something being placed back in the right spot after years of being stored wrong. He shifted again, hands in his pockets like he wasn't sure what to do with them. I'm not here to make excuses, he added. Just wanted you to know. I saw what happened. All of it. And I know they crossed a line. They didn't just cross it, I said. They paved a whole walkway over it. I second. A short, surprised laugh escaped him. Yeah. That sounds about right. We stood there in the hallway, no audience, no judge, no script. Just two people who used to be closer and then weren't, trying to speak in a language neither of us had practiced in years. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. It was my grandfather's old brass compass. He'd want you to have this, my father said, placing it in my hand. The weight felt familiar. He told me it was for finding your way when you felt lost. I figure you've earned it more than I ever did. He looked toward the exit. You heading to the farm? Yes. He nodded. I'll swing by later. He hesitated, then added, not to cause trouble, just to help, if you'll let me. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't reach for a hug, didn't cry, didn't beg for forgiveness, or try to rewrite our history. He just offered something small and real, a step toward something better, without pretending the past hadn't happened. I gave a simple nod. If you want. He gave one back. I do. We walked toward the exit together, not side by side exactly, but with enough distance to acknowledge the years between us and enough closeness to acknowledge they didn't have to stay that way. The glass doors swung open, and the breeze from outside felt cooler than the hallway air. My father didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. He just headed to his truck, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot with a kind of steadiness I hadn't seen from him in years. I stepped into the sunlight, the folder tucked under my arm, the weight of the morning settling in the most grounded part of me, as if the truth itself had finally stopped moving. The sunlight hit the pavement in clean lines as I stepped out of the courthouse, the folder tucked firmly beneath my arm. The warmth on my face grounded me more than anything that had happened inside. My father's truck was already a speck disappearing down the road, and instead of leaving me with frustration or old resentment, it left a quiet steadiness, something I hadn't associated with him in a very long time. I walked to my car, opened the door, and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. The air smelled faintly of pine from the old tree-shaped air freshener I refused to replace, even though the scent was long gone. Cooper's empty seat beside me felt like encouragement rather than solitude. I started the engine, the hum settling into a familiar rhythm, and turned toward the road leading back to the farm. The drive wasn't long, but it always managed to feel like a shift between two different worlds. Town noise faded into long stretches of open fields, old barns collapsed in on themselves like tired men, and power lines cut across the sky like someone had drawn them with a ruler. Every mile made the courthouse feel smaller behind me, trivial even, compared to the land waiting ahead. When I pulled into the dirt driveway, Cooper's head popped up in the front window before he hobbled his way to the door, tail wagging lazily. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my boots. The farmhouse stood in front of me, worn, weathered, imperfect, but with a shape that never failed to settle something deep inside my chest. I walked up the porch steps and tested each one the way Grandpa used to. Still creaky, still solid, still here. Inside, the house smelled like wood dust and old memories. A faint breeze drifted through the cracked kitchen window, carrying hints of pine, damp earth, and something familiar I couldn't quite name. I placed the folder on the kitchen table, next to the coffee mug I'd left there earlier that morning. It felt fitting truth sitting beside routine. Cooper limped over and nudged my leg. I scratched behind his ear. "We've got work to do," I said, and he huffed like he agreed. I grabbed the toolbox from the corner and headed outside. The porch railing had been loose for years. Someone should have fixed it long ago. I tightened screws, sanded down rough edges, and replaced a split board. Each task pulled me further out of the courthouse and deeper into the simple clarity of doing something real with my hands. By the time I moved on to the fence along the backfield, sweat trickled down my neck and dust coated the knees of my jeans. The fence didn't ask questions. It didn't demand explanations. It just needed fixing. I liked things like that. I crouched beside one of the broken posts, measuring the new board against the old one, when a familiar rumble approached the driveway. I didn't even look up at first. I knew that engine. Old pickup, slightly misfiring in the cold, the kind of vehicle my father refused to replace out of principle and stubborn pride. The truck door slammed shut. Heavy steps crunched across the gravel. I kept working, not out of dismissal but because stopping felt unnecessary. My father stopped a few feet away. "Didn't think you'd start without me," he said. "You didn't give me a schedule," I replied. He snorted a small, reluctant sound. "Fair enough." He stood there for a moment, staring at the fence like he was trying to judge whether it deserved the effort. Then, without ceremony, he bent down, grabbed the spare hammer I'd tossed onto the grass, and began helping. No speech, no apology wrapped in metaphors, no attempt to rewrite anything. Just action. The kind Grandpa always valued more than talk. We worked side by side, and the rhythm settled quickly. Measure, hold, nail, repeat. Sweat and dust made the air warm and sharp. Cooper patrolled lazily behind us, sniffing at every board like he was conducting quality control. After a while, my father spoke, his voice low. "This place, he built it right." "He did. He trusted you with it." I hammered a nail into place. "He trusted me to take care of something he loved." My father leaned back on his heels. "He also knew you wouldn't run from work. Running wasn't really my style." He gave a faint smile. "No, you always ran toward the hard stuff. Even as a kid. Especially as a kid." We didn't look at each other while we talked. It made everything easier. No need for eye contact, no pressure to perform sincerity. Just two people focusing on the same piece of wood, letting truth land naturally. He drove the next nail in with steady precision. "Your mother's having a hard time accepting how it played out," he said. "She made choices," I replied. "She did," he admitted. "And they weren't the right ones. But I won't pretend she wasn't scared either." "As you will." "Scared of what?" He exhaled, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Losing you. Losing him. Losing control." He shrugged. "She doesn't handle change well." "She didn't handle me well," I said simply. He didn't argue. That alone was progress. We kept working until the sun lowered and the fence stretched straight again. Not perfect, but solid, honest. The kind of work that didn't lie about what it took to get done. When we finished, my father walked toward the house while I stayed behind a moment, taking in the shape of the restored line across the field. Cooper leaned against my leg, warm and steady, and I scratched his head before heading up the porch. My father stood inside the doorway, looking around the house as if seeing it clearly for the first time. His eyes moved from the kitchen counter to the window frames to the worn floorboards. "You know," he said quietly, It already looks better. Feels better too. It's getting there, I said. He nodded. You're doing right by him. I rested my hand on the doorframe. That's the point. He cleared his throat, hesitating like he wasn't sure if the next sentence had permission to exist. Haley, you don't have to do this alone. I looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, the distance between us didn't feel like a wall, more like a long path we were finally standing on at the same time. We'll see, I said, not dismissive, not closed off. Just honest. He accepted that with a small nod. Yeah, we will. He walked toward the truck, not rushing, not retreating, just leaving in a way that felt appropriate. Cooper watched him go, then climbed onto the porch and dropped beside me with a grunt. The light shifted as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the field. I inhaled slowly. The house, the land, the work ahead, it all felt grounded now, anchored in truth instead of conflict. I stepped inside, the old floorboards creaking under my boots, and the quiet wrapped around me without feeling empty. There was more to fix, more to rebuild, more to understand. But for the first time in years, none of it felt like a burden. It simply felt like something worth doing. The house felt different the next morning, the kind of difference you don't see at first but feel in the way the air settles. I woke early out of habit, the same internal clock that used to push me out of a bunk before sunrise. Cooper stretched beside the bed, joints popping like old floorboards, and I scratched his side before heading into the kitchen. The coffee maker clicked on with its familiar stubborn grind, and the smell drifted through the house like a quiet reminder that routine had a place here again. I stood at the window sipping from a chipped mug, watching a thin mist rise off the field. The fence my father and I repaired cut a straight line across the property, solid and clean. It was the kind of visual proof I'd never needed but appreciated more than I expected. The work from yesterday lingered on my arms, faint soreness in the shoulders, a tightness in my palms from gripping wood and tools. The honest kind of ache. By noon I had picked up supplies in town paint, new fixtures, a set of screws that would outlast anything Lydia ever tried to undo. When I stepped out of the hardware store, I spotted my father leaning against his truck again, arms crossed loosely, the same stance he used when deciding whether to speak or stay silent. You're back early, I said. He shrugged. Figured you'd need a hand with the inside. You figured right. He grabbed a bucket of paint from my cart without asking and tossed it into the truck bed. There was something oddly soothing about watching him move through tasks without commentary, without the stiff awkwardness of the day before. He wasn't trying to perform anything. He was just showing up. Back at the farmhouse, we tackled the living room first. The walls were faded in a way that suggested the paint had stopped trying years ago. My father pried open a can of fresh white, dipped a roller, and began at the far corner. I took the opposite wall. The smell of paint mingled with old wood and felt strangely comforting. You know, he said after a few minutes, keeping his eyes on the roller, your granddad would have hated this color. He hated every color that wasn't named after a tree, I replied. He chuckled. True enough. Less. We painted in steady lines, quiet but not strained. At one point he paused, dipped the roller again and said, Your mother wants to come by tomorrow. I kept painting. Why? She's got questions. He paused, then added, and things she wants to say. I'm not interested in another fight. I don't think she is either, he said, but I can't promise she won't make it weird. That sounds accurate. He didn't try to soften it, didn't defend her, just nodded and kept working. When we finished the room, sunlight hit the fresh paint and made the whole place feel less like a relic and more like something alive. I carried the empty cans out back, and when I returned, the screen door creaked as someone stepped onto the porch. My father stiffened just slightly, not out of anger, but awareness. My mother stood there, hands clasped, wearing the same pearl necklace she wore at every event she deemed important. She looked smaller than usual, not physically, but in the way someone does when they've run out of excuses. She cleared her throat. I didn't want to interrupt, she said. You did, I replied, but it's fine. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the walls. It looks different. That was the idea. My father set down his roller, leaning it carefully against the tray. He didn't leave, but he didn't wedge himself into the conversation either. My mother walked further in, looking around like she expected the house to judge her. Your grandfather would have liked these changes. she said softly. He would have liked honesty more, I answered. She winced, not dramatically, not manipulative, just visibly. Haley, I know what we did, and I know how it looked, but we weren't trying to hurt you. You sued me, I said. That was Lydia's doing. I shouldn't have supported it. I know that now. End of. My father stayed quiet but close enough that she knew he wasn't there to rescue her from her own truth. She clasped her hands tighter. I was angry when you left, and I was hurt when you didn't come home for things. I took it personally instead of understanding. I didn't come home because every time I did, you compared me to someone who never had to earn anything. My mother blinked, tears forming but not falling. You're right. It was the first time those words had ever crossed her lips without being dragged out of her. She took a breath. You're strong and you're capable and you're... She stopped, searching for a word that didn't sound like she practiced it in the car. You're someone I didn't know how to raise. My father shifted, surprised by her honesty. She continued, voice thin but steady. I didn't understand who you wanted to be. I didn't understand the military. And I didn't understand how someone in our family could choose a harder path instead of the easy one. That's because you and Lydia chose easy every time, I said. Not accusing, just stating the record. She nodded. And I regret that. I can't fix what happened in court, but I can say I'm sorry for my part in it. She looked at my father. Both of us are. He nodded. A small, simple confirmation. I'm not asking you to forgive us today, she said. But I want us to try. As a family, if that's something you want to. She didn't cry. She didn't invent new stories. She didn't cling to pride. She spoke plainly the way people talk when they're finally tired of their own walls. I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness isn't a switch. It's a decision you reach slowly, like adjusting your footing after a long walk uphill. I looked around the room, the fresh paint, the repaired window frame, the sunlight catching the dust in the air. This place had held every version of my family, good and bad. And it wasn't going anywhere. We can try, I said, but it has to be honest. She nodded, relief softening her expression. Honest, she repeated. We spent the rest of the afternoon working. Not talking, not arguing, just working. My mother wiped down the windows. My father sanded an old door. I repainted the remaining trim. Cooper supervised like a retired sergeant with low patience and high expectations. As the light faded, the house looked different, brighter, cleaner. Not perfect, but in motion. That evening, after my parents drove away, I sat on the porch with Cooper at my feet. The sky shifted into shades of purple and gold. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and damp soil. I pulled Grandpa's old compass from my pocket, the one Dad gave me the night he finally said something real, and opened it. The needle steadied north just as it always did. Honor isn't a medal. Forgiveness isn't weakness. And family isn't determined by who shouts the loudest, but by who stays, admits, repairs, and tries again. The porch light flickered on as the sun dipped completely behind the field. Not a signal, not a story beat. Just a quiet truth settling into place in the house my grandfather built, and in the life I was finally living on my own terms.